cannot present your slides, Professor. I mean, it's a very difficult topic. So perplexities of Brazilians. So anyway, so yeah. Yeah, no, it's so the title is scary. So so sorry. Sorry? No, I don't have slides. So sorry. So first of all, sorry.
That's the reason why.
So sorry. No, sorry. Okay. I don't have slides here. Really sorry for that.
So in this case, you can present these slides.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. That's right. So sorry about that. I don't have slides here with me. But thank you so much for the invitation, Mario. And it's a great pleasure to be with you here. Everybody here in this panel, Mariana, my co-author, and Professor Ariosvaldo. Great pleasure to participate in those discussions. Actually fascinating to see those discussions in law. I'm just a humble professor of management, so it's great to participate in those high-level discussions about the institutions and so on. So anyway, I was talking to Mario about this panel, so we exchanged some messages about what I should or could talk, and Mario suggested an exchange we had in, I think it was last year, right, Mario, about an article we wrote about the role of BNDES, our huge development bank here in Brazil, and we exchanged some. We published an article, and then we exchanged some messages, and in the end, our disagreement was less real than we initially thought. Yeah, you reacted. Yeah, we had an exchange in a local newspaper, and we exchanged some messages. So anyway, I'm going to build my argument based on this central claim that you have in this literature of private investment. The idea is to explain private investment, how private investors will allocate capital, especially if they invest in long-term projects that are more difficult, non-redeployable, more specific assets. I don't know, a road, an electricity plant, whatever, something that is more long-term in a sense. I guess we have evidence in the literature that institutions are crucial to foster those kinds of investments. I guess that you have this kind of conclusion. I don't know, but we can disagree. Even myself, I have some empirical results along those lines. Improvements in domestic institutions, right? Reducing transaction costs and all types of risks, the risks that the government will expropriate assets, whatever, will improve private investment. And also, if you increase the quality of institutions, perhaps you reduce transaction costs. Also in the financial markets, you can have more credit, availability of money, et cetera, et cetera. And a corollary of that is that if you have less developed institutions, then some sort of state involvement would be necessary. So that's exactly the type of justification that we usually have to justify the presence of state-owned banks or a development bank like BNDES. I don't know if Professor Trubeck, Professor Pistor know about this bank. I guess so, right? But it's a huge bank, and in its heyday, it was lending in 2010 or something. It was lending relatively, so the same amount, or actually not the same amount, 3 times the World Bank in the world, actually. So it is a big bank, and the presence of the bank is usually justified by the fact that we don't have a long-term credit market, and in existence of a long-term credit market is usually justified by the lack of good institutions, because parties cannot write long-term credit contracts because everything's so uncertain. You have huge problems, huge transaction costs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in a sense, you need state involvement to help in this process, right? So I do not deny, I'm a critic, I haven't been a critic of those things, but I'm not denying this basic thesis. The only thing is that it needs to be refined in two ways. First, historically, and let's say considering heterogeneities that can occur within the country, right? I'm going to explain those 2 points in the sequence. So, historical. This kind of hypothesis, institutions will foster private investment. Okay, I mean, we have evidence on that kind of thing. But usually when you go to apply discussions, you have the following argument. Okay, so institutions are difficult to change, right? You cannot change institutions, so over time. So in a sense, you need the state, you need some sort of intervention because it will be difficult to change institutions. They are more or less fixed. So this could be a strong form of path dependence. So you have a really dramatic form of path dependence, saying that you have a fixed set of institutions that will constrain certain types of private action, right? Including private investment, funded by long-term capital. Well, I'm not denying this, of course. I mean, we know that institutions are path dependent, but I guess institutions are not as path dependent as, you know, it seems that we have some variability through time. If we take a look at this historical cases, then we're going to see in many countries several variations over time. And surprise, surprise, even here in Brazil, we have evidence that in the past, more precisely in the beginning of last century, we had a thriving market for long-term credit, right? Especially in 1915. I mean, the first, I would say, the first quarter of last century. This was studied by my co-author, Aldo Musacchio. And essentially what we had then was a market for corporate bonds that reached 18% of the Brazilian GDP by that time. And currently, I guess it's 6 or 7 or something, 6 to 8%. Etc. So we had a market for long-term credit, private, right? Funding, for instance, railroads and other types of investments, right? What happened in that particular period? We had several institutions or institutional traits that helped foster long-term credit. For instance, bankruptcy law was better. I mean, we had several types of provisions against default, et cetera, et cetera. You had less intervention. I mean, several aspects that explained how you had that kind of development in long-term capital. So it's not that we have a colonial kind of let's say, you know, heritage that will constrain severely our set of institutions and how we can develop those institutions over time, right? So we need to examine variations over time, and it seems that one very practical solution to a problem, right? We have lack of funding for long-term capital. One solution is, you know, our institutions are more or less fixed. Let's have more state intervention. The other solution would be, can we change somehow the institutions? Or, I mean, if we assume a strong form of path dependence, no. I mean, so some form of state intervention would be necessary. If you think you can change somehow over time, marginally, certain institutional traits, then you're going to say, to actually say, well, let's perhaps we can follow that other path. And actually, we have, if you take a look at the experiments that occur over time, then you can think of potential changes in institutions that can foster long-term investment. So we followed, even in this moment in Brazil where you have high risk, etc., we followed some cases of funding private investment where you could have 100% private capital, even for long-term investment. And the key thing is to think of certain changes in institutional aspects that will reduce all those risks perceived by private investors and private lenders, right? For instance, we followed a project in the port of Santos here in the state of São Paulo, where first of all, it is a private port, right? It's a kind of private concession, and two parties that operate in the port created transfers or prices to operate the passage of the ships, the shipments, etc. And those prices, those transfers were used as some sort of guarantee to issue bonds, corporate bonds in the financial market. So kind of an investment fund issued corporate bonds in the financial market. And those kind of prices were used as a guarantee. Crucial here was that, they could eliminate certain types of risks that were available or present in a common market, in the common financial market, because, the port was privately run, they could have transfers, etc., so they could fund several types of long-term investments with private capital, with corporate bonds, right, as we had before in Brazil, in the example that I gave you in the beginning of last century, right? So this is one. Perhaps institutions are not that fixed as we think. Perhaps we can implement some changes, some improvements, etc., that can cause some sort of marginal changes in certain directions. The second point is that institutions can vary within countries, right? You can have different types of institutions, or using the term of Professor Pistor, you can have some plurality in terms of institutions, right? You can have some heterogeneity. And here, let me tell you the results of another research we did. So we essentially examined 1,000 public-private partnerships throughout the world. 30 countries, we have a database, 30 countries, more than 30 countries, I guess, several sectors. And we are particularly interested in the extent of private involvement in public-private partnerships, because we also have variations in that respect. A public-private partnership is not a monolithic kind of form, so we have huge variations. For instance, one investor can come and operate a facility, I don't know, electricity facility or a road that was built by the government. So the government allocated capital to that, so you just come along and operate the thing. This is, I would say, yes, I'm finishing. Yeah. So this is, I would say, it's a project with low private scope, low private investment, low private involvement. Or the private firm can come and say, no, I'll help design the thing. I'll help design the airport. I'll help design whatever. I will invest my time and effort and money to design something, and I'm going to own the thing. I'm going to invest in the thing. So this will be more private involvement. So we coded that, and as expected, right, as supporting that hypothesis that I mentioned before, the better the quality of the institutions of the country, measured according to the same usual measures that we have. The World Bank measures, several others, other surveys, etc. We have several types of ways to measure that. But if you improve that, you have more private involvement in those public-private partnerships. So private actors will engage more, investing more, designing the thing, etc., etc. So supporting that hypothesis. However, a very interesting result that he got is that you know that in several countries, several states actually, and several municipalities, you are subject to a macro institution, but you can develop your micro institutions. For instance, you can create an unit, a bureaucratic unit dealing with public-private partnerships with certain rules. You can, okay, there's corruption in the whole public bureaucracy, okay, but in this unit, no. We're going to have technical guys, insulated, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to create particular laws for PPPs, particular legal provisions. We're going to increase the confidence that investors will have in those types of projects. So we try to code that, the existence and the experience of those units, specialized units to deal with public-private partnerships. Okay? One finding was that the creation of those things doesn't have a general effect on the involvement, the private involvement, or the degree of private involvement. Doesn't have a direct effect, overarching, general. But the presence of those units will be particularly important, positive, to influence private investment when the quality of institutions is low, right? So when countries have low-quality institutions creating all sorts of risks and transaction costs, it seems that the creation of those insulated units will be particularly important. So this, in our view, this indicates that you don't really have a homogeneous set of institutions at the country level, but actually have several types of variations in institutional traits, et cetera, that can be applied and generate certain types of results. So to conclude, I would, if you're interested in examining this link or the determinants of private investment, I think it would be crucial to do two things. One is to examine and study experiments that occurred in those countries, whatever country you want to study, experiments that occurred throughout history, because there's huge variation. And by the way, big opportunities to do research, right? If you have changes and exogenous variations, et cetera, over time, and you can learn a lot. And perhaps you can have some answers to some difficult questions. And second, examine plurality or heterogeneity within a given country, or within a given region, because you may have different types of conditions, rules, etc., within the country, right? I'm not talking about throughout the globe, of course, but within each country may have some heterogeneity that can be worth examining and studying, right? So this is what I had to say. I hope that I followed your recommendation, Mario. But anyway, this is I'm really glad to be here and looking forward to our comments. Thank you.